everyone. Like Hami said, I am Dr. Megan Carpenter. I am a social psychologist and an assistant professor here at St. Lawrence University. And my research does largely center around human sexuality and gender, including how power dynamics influence women's interest in casual sex, which college students love to hear about, and how different contextual factors influence our adherence to gender norms. Now, outside of all of my teaching and scholarship, I am a Golden Girls super fan, and I know, right? Yes. And I'm the mom of 2 cats, Cookie Monster and Eleanor Roosevelt. I will tell them that you approved. And more relevant to today's discussion, I am an openly bisexual woman. Hi, Mom and Dad. So, before we get started, I'm going to be using some terms today that may not be completely familiar to everyone. So, for example, when I refer to LGBTQ plus individuals, I'm talking about a really diverse group of people that includes those that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, pansexual, and many, many more. Queer in this context refers to people whose sexual and romantic attractions isn't strictly heterosexual. And transgender is a term that's used to describe people whose gender identity and gender expression doesn't conform to that that's typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. And trans is considered an umbrella term, which means that it applies to a lot of different identity groups, such as people who identify as trans women, or agender, or genderqueer. Cisgender, on the other hand, refers to people whose gender identity and expression does correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. So, for example, people who are assigned the sex of female at birth and who identify as women typically consider themselves cisgender women. I'm on this stage today to talk about some of our inclusion efforts for LGBTQ plus members of our campus communities. Now, currently, these efforts typically center around providing support to our students. I would like to talk about how we can better utilize our queer and trans faculty in that support system, but also how the current system largely does not extend its support to our faculty, and that cuts us off as a source of support for our students. One of the most important issues that I talk about in my human sexuality and gender courses is the high rate of mental illness for LGBTQ plus populations, and how those rates of mental illness are directly related to experiences with prejudice and discrimination. This relationship was outlined in 1995 by Elon Meyer in what he called minority stress theory, and I know that looks scary, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. Essentially, what this theory is telling us is that people belonging to different marginalized identity groups experience elevated rates of prejudice and discrimination. Sometimes these experiences are overt and even violent. Other times, these experiences are classified as microaggressions, which broadly speaking are verbal, nonverbal, sometimes even environmental snubs and insults that communicate messages of hostility and prejudice towards someone because of that person's marginalized identities. Now, what's tricky about microaggressions is they're often really subtle, and that makes them seem harmless, but they have a cumulative impact on our well-being. Kevin Nadal and colleagues in a 2011 article about sexual orientation microaggressions called that cumulative impact death by 1,000 cuts. So while a single microaggression or insult might result in a single cut, people belonging to marginalized identity groups are constantly exposed to these messages, and each new message, each new microaggression results in a new wound. And it's that experience with elevated rates of microaggressions and prejudice and hostility that lead to the development of chronic stress and the perception of our environments as hostile, and that leads to the elevated rates of mental illness. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, LGBTQ plus individuals are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness like depression or anxiety. And that metaphor of death by 1,000 cuts is sometimes made literal when we consider that these individuals are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. So what do we do with this information? Higher education communities have attempted to address this relationship by looking at 2 parts of this model. First, by trying to change our campus climates to reduce those experiences with prejudice and discrimination. And second, by trying to provide more instrumental social support for our students. And there's been a lot of different structural inclusion efforts that have been designed to do this, like establishing LGBTQ+ student organizations. And they make a huge impact on our students' well-being. But what I'm arguing today is that we're missing a major source of potential support for our students: queer and trans faculty. There have been an increased emphasis in recent years to try and hire more diverse faculty. But, much like our students, queer and trans faculty face a lot of personal and structural barriers that prevent us from coming out to our students. A lot of those center around the tenure process. Now, for those of you who don't know about the tenure process, faculty and tenure-track jobs go through a series of promotions that take about 5 to 7 years before you can reach tenure, a point at which your job is essentially secure. If you don't achieve tenure, you have to leave your institution and find a job elsewhere. And when you consider that the average tenure-track job has literally hundreds of applications, not getting tenure and having to find a new job is potentially career-ending, and I can't believe I just said that out loud. It's scary. And there's a lot that is involved in this process, including your publications and scholarship, letters of support from your colleagues, your teaching record and evaluations, and also your university and professional service. And the whole point of this system is to ensure that universities can maintain really high-quality faculty that contribute significantly to the field of study and who can teach our students in lasting and meaningful ways. And as a pre-tenure faculty member, I am really conscious of the things I need to be doing in the next few years in order to get tenure. And as a queer woman, I am also conscious of the struggles that I might face that my heterosexual peers might not. Now, research done by Villamoria and Stewart in a 2009 article about hostile work environments and career consequences for LGBTQ+ faculty illustrate a lot of the different experiences that can ultimately jeopardize that career outcome of getting tenure. Some of what they talk about in this research relates to overt hostility. For example, refusing to take someone's data seriously because they identify as a lesbian. I know. Other experiences represented in this research talk about more implicit forms of bias, like increased scrutiny and stereotyping. A really prominent example of this is the belief that there is a hidden gay agenda and that gay people are unwilling or unable to understand other people's perspectives. That belief in a hidden gay agenda then leads people to pay much closer attention to gay faculty's scholarship, teaching, and advising. Other experiences represented in Villamoria and Stewart's research talk about how queer and trans faculty feel isolated, especially if there are no other queer or trans faculty in their department. And sometimes these experiences related to tokenism, which, broadly speaking, is the practice of hiring or including someone to appear diverse. And this is not an experience that's specific to queer or trans people. It's often reported as an experience for people of color. And as a further point of clarification, queer and trans people and people of color are not mutually exclusive groups. And queer and trans people of color experience microaggressions like tokenism even more so than white queer and trans people or than straight cisgender people of color. Now, as a result of tokenism, people are often identified by how they're different from everyone else. And I experience this when my students talk about me as being the bisexual professor. Not the social psychologist, not the expert in human sexuality, not even the lady who's obsessed with her cats, or who has a weird fixation on a TV show from the 80s, but rather by how I violate that heterosexual norm. Other experiences represented in this research talk about how isolation related to being excluded from professional and peer networks, and also having a lack of access to mentors with similar identities or experiences. And if you don't have access to mentors with similar experiences and identities, if you end up excluded from these different professional and peer networks, that limits the number of letters of support you can get when you go up for tenure, and it also limits the number of service opportunities you're reached out to participate in. Furthermore, some participants in this research talked about how they were explicitly told to conceal their identities. One participant talked about being told to tone down their gayness and to not ask questions about partner benefits. And this is something that I can relate to because I heard these messages to not self-disclose identity on the job market. And while I know that these messages are meant well, people are trying to protect me from jeopardizing career outcomes, what it ultimately does is silence me as a queer person. Now imagine everyone is getting these messages. If everyone is being silenced, it makes it impossible to find a support network. It makes it impossible to find people who can help you navigate this heteronormative and cisnormative university system. Research by LaSala and colleagues in 2008 extend this work talking about different jeopardizing outcomes for LGBTQ faculty and talk about constraints on scholarship. A common assumption is that if you identify as queer and or trans, that your research is going to be about these identity groups. But if you do this research, it's often considered less valuable or less rigorous than other non-identity-based research, and as a result of that, there's lack of access to funding to do the work in the first place. So not only do people assume you're going to do the research, they're not going to consider it as rigorous, you're not going to have access to funding, that limits your ability to publish the work. Now there's a lot listed on the screen, but we haven't even begun to talk about more macro-level barriers, like discrimination in hiring processes, or the fact that queer and trans faculty are also experiencing elevated rates of mental illness in comparison to their cisgender and heterosexual peers. We haven't talked about microaggressions in classroom dynamics or how they're produced in teaching evaluations. And we really haven't talked about how all of these different factors are compounded for faculty with multiple marginalized identities, as is the case for queer and trans people of color. All of these things restrict access to tenure for our faculty. So considering these different factors, how do queer and trans faculty limit their exposure to discrimination and stigma and prejudice? A common solution is to stay in the closet. A recent study by Garvey and Rankin found that on a scale of 1, meaning not out to anyone, to 5, meaning out to everyone, the average faculty outness score in their sample was 1.8. And while being in the closet limits your exposure to this prejudice, to this discrimination, it renders you invisible. And if you aren't visible, then your students don't have visible role models, and your students don't have accessible sources of social support. So where do we go from here? I have 4 suggestions on how we can better support our faculty and ultimately better support our students as well. The first is that we should establish anonymous identity-based groups for our faculty. These groups can provide social support for our faculty and mentorship for junior faculty. They can do programming with LGBTQ+ organizations for students. Second, all universities should establish anti-discrimination policies that protect people based on gender identity and sexual orientation, regardless of whether state or federal law mandates this. Now, something important about these anti-discrimination policies is they often protect against more overt experiences with prejudice and discrimination. So I would like to add on to this microaggression training for students, faculty, and staff. And lastly, many of our universities have ongoing diversity-related efforts, like having speaker series to center conversations around prejudice and discrimination. We should include LGBTQ+ issues and identities in our ongoing efforts. Now, I'm not standing in front of you today saying that we should all come out because it would help our students. What I am saying is that at the university level, we should be doing more to support our faculty, and that by supporting our faculty, we will ultimately support our students as well. Thank you.